have you joining us for worship this morning. If you are tuning in online this morning, I hate to say it, but you are really missing out because today is Omelet Bar Sunday. If you are here in person and you're saying, hey, wait a second, I didn't know about the omelets and you want to go grab one, I'm not going to be offended if you walk out. Cody might be offended if you walk out during worship. You can go grab one quick before they pack that up. It's a great fundraiser to send our children and youth to camp. And so if you'd like to support that, even if you don't want an omelet, you can mark missions on your check. So it's a great Sunday, a great event. Thank you so much to Craig Starr for organizing it and our volunteers this morning. We really appreciate that. We have a great team of people that put together their time and they share their talents. And we would not be a church without one another, right? Without that encouragement, without that support, whether we're going through a hard time, whether we have a celebration, we come together to encourage each other in our faith and to worship God. And so we invite you to stand and join us as we begin worship this morning.
we all were aware. So we love you. Thank you. We sing these things to you. In your name we pray. Amen.
You may be seated. At this time, we are going to dismiss our kids to head on down the hall for Kids on Worship with Miss Allie. And share a few brief announcements with you. Actually, I'm going to head over here to preach, Chad, so throw it out a little bit and move. I just want to highlight a few quick announcements. First off, thank you so much for joining us this morning for worship. I'm always excited when I kick off a new message series, so you are here on a good day. Hopefully I'll give my best. We do have a way of just wanting to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. If you are a guest, we have a free coffee mug, a little travel mug, as just our way of saying thank you so much for joining us for worship this morning. If you want to take a moment to go ahead and scan that QR code that's in your program, there are two this week. The red one is our virtual record of attendance, or if you're tuning in online, you can go ahead and click the link there and just drop us a note to say hello. Let us know that you are joining us for worship this morning. There's a spot to share any prayer requests. Maybe you know somebody that's kind of going through a tough time that you would like to request some prayers. You can go ahead and fill out any prayer requests or your response to the service there. Also, if you would like to, maybe you're here and you're like, man, it smells good today. I'm sorry that I missed the omelet bar, but I'd still love to support the youth fundraiser to help raise camperships to send kids to camp, children, youth, adults to camp. You can do so by going to elkinmarketchurch.com and highlighting missions, so selecting the missions option. And all of our missions offering this month will be going to support providing camperships. I don't know, but about you, who's here has gone to camp as a youth? Anyone? I'm going to pick on somebody a little bit older, Chris Jensen. Do you even recall how much it was when you went to camp?
Nothing for me.
Nothing for Chris Jensen. I think I had to mow the church lawn 5 times to raise like $50 to go to church camp when I was a youth. Kind of launched my lawn mowing career there. Anybody else? Chase, do you know what it costs to go to camp today?
No.
No? Because Mom filled out the registration form, right?
Yeah.
It's now up to like $400 for a week at camp. And it's just, everything's gone up. And so if you would like to help make camp possible for someone, you can go ahead and designate a gift towards missions. The other, I'm going to remember Chris, announcement, because I picked on him. The other announcement I wanted to highlight, giving statements. We have giving statements for the first quarter. It took me that long to write the letter. First quarter is ready to go, so I'm a month behind. And then, so if you would like to pick up your giving statement and you are here in person, you can go ahead and grab that on your way out. Otherwise, we will certainly mail them. And we want to say thank you so much for your support, your financial contributions, help make all this ministry possible, help us to continue to be a light shining in our Elkina Market area.
And they're on the same table as the offering.
Same table as the offering box. All right. Melissa's not here to remind me of any other announcements that I might forget, so we're just going to pretend like I got them all today. Sound good? The blue QR code in your program is actually for a online, just kind of a grief survey. As we kick off this message series called Good Grief, I know some of you have walked down some hard roads before. You might have some words of wisdom to share. And as we do this message series, it's just a brief survey that reflect on how have we experienced grief. Are there things that you find helpful? Are there things that you don't find helpful? I promise I won't share your story unless you would like me to share your story or to share some insights. But it's just our way to kind of keep in mind, where are we as a community right now when it comes to grief? Have you ever had one of those moments where you just don't really have the words to express how you are feeling or what it is that you're thinking? I mean, it seems like I have those moments frequently, but I'm talking about some of those moments where it seems like, life is just so heavy. Like there's this weight that I'm carrying, and I just don't know how to express myself. Like I come to God in prayer and I'm like, God, I don't even know where to begin. And it's in moments like that I find that the Psalms are really helpful to give me a voice to my prayers. In fact, for generations, the book of Psalms has been used as a book of worship, as a book of prayer for the church from generations. Even before Jesus came, they were going through the Psalms and reciting these wonderful psalms of praise and thanksgiving. But did you know that 38%, over a third of the book of Psalms, 150 chapters in the book of Psalms, over 38% of the book of Psalms contains prayers of lament, portions of lament. And the laments are those portions where, like, we are going through a hard time and we're crying out to God and we offer God our pleas and our thanksgiving. And it kind of makes me pause and wonder if over a third of the book of Psalms contain laments, then what's that say about those laments that we have of our own, right? And those hard times that we go through, that we can pour out our hearts to God, even in those hard times, with our pleas and our praise. Because it's often in these moments that we live and dwell, that moment between the plea and the praise, when we're waiting for God to answer our prayers. Well, today we are kicking off a message series called Good Grief, and whether we want to face it or not, grief simply is a part of life, isn't it? We would not grieve if we did not love, right? We grieve the things that we love, whether we are talking about the loss of a loved one, whether we are talking about the loss of a friend, maybe it's the loss of a job or an opportunity. When those things happen, when we lose something, we grieve, don't we? As we go through that moment. And the deeper we love, the deeper we grieve. But while loss might be a part of life, it doesn't mean that we are always good at it. We all experience loss, we all experience grief, but I don't know if any of us would necessarily say that we figured out how to grieve well, or that we are experts in grief, or that we hold all the answers, because it impacts each one of us a little bit differently, doesn't it? And sometimes when it comes to grief, we might find some pretty typical responses. For instance, anyone just want to ignore it and deny it and pretend like, oh, you know what, this terrible thing didn't happen. It's not going to happen to me. I have great job security. I'm a United Methodist pastor and an appointment system, and so that they're guaranteeing me, basically. We're always going to have a church for you to serve. And then something happens, and it's like the denomination is kind of arguing, and you're going like, oh, what's that future look like, right? Maybe you feel like, you know what, I'm young, I'm healthy, relatively healthy. Dave knows that I struggle on the basketball court at times with injuries. Relatively healthy, right? Nothing bad's ever going to happen to me. I'm not going to sick. Never going to deal with cancer. Never going to have to deal with any of that, right? Sometimes we deny it. We go through that moment, and it's like, it'll never happen to us. And then we receive that news, and it's like, I just don't want to believe it. Right? It can't be true. It can't happen to them. It's not going to happen to me. Or maybe we have a difficult time accepting the situation for what it might be. When we're told we're not going to be able to do something again. When we realize we're not going to be able to enjoy that time together anymore. Sometimes we respond to grief by simply denying it. Other times we think, well, we're here in church. That means we're kind of spiritual people. We believe in God. Well, I know I'm gonna pull out a spiritual sounding answer and say, you know what, it must be God's will. It must be God's will. I mean, we've heard that one before. Maybe we've even said it before. We're thinking, well, it's when God's timing comes, then it's God's timing. And, you know, sometimes we hear phrases like, well, God must have had a reason, or God needed another angel, and so that's why this person's God. And while sometimes it might be comforting in the moment, the theology is a little suspect, isn't it? Because it makes us kind of scratch our head and wonder, like, how could it be God's grief or God's will in this circumstance? Is it like God is lonely that he needs to take my loved one? What about that little girl who loses her father and she's saying, but I need my daddy, I need my angel? What about the youth that was killed by a drunk driver? By the result of the choices or the consequences of someone else, not by her own. And so sometimes it just doesn't resonate very well, does it? Sometimes we lose someone for no reason at all. And while God is sovereign, I am always cautious about proclaiming something as God's will or not, because guess what? On the grand scheme of things, I'm probably down here in knowing exactly what God is up to, right? Just when we think we have God figured out, surprise, and we are reminded where we are once again. And so I'm always careful about proclaiming God's will on a person's loss or a person's grief. And instead, I want to turn to what is it that we can be assured of? What do we know? We know that God promises to be with us in our time of grief. That God assures us of His love. That we have a hope in Christ Jesus. That we will live again. And even though we will experience death in this life, we know that there is a life to come. These are the things that we turn to. How about this one? Sometimes we like to get busy. Any busybodies here? Going through that hard time, going through some grief, and it's like, you know what? I have a job to do. I need to do X, Y, Z. And so we go through those moments. We go through those motions. We get ourselves busy or distracted so we don't have to dwell upon it, right? For me, I'm really guilty of this. I realized early on in my ministry, I think in the first several years of ministry, I did more funerals than the pastor that I was working with on my internship. And so I learned really quickly how to get good at doing a funeral service, but I realized I can be really bad at processing the grief and walking through that journey, because there's a whole lot more that takes place other than the funeral services. And so I can go into that moment and be like, okay, I've got a job to do, I got to help organize people, I got to be strong for other people. But being strong doesn't mean that we ignore the feelings or we press our grief deep down inside, does it? Instead, we can be strong by sharing what we are going through. The fourth common response that we have in the face of grief is we might look for a way to escape it, a way to escape mortality. And so we might look to our family and the kind of impact or the legacy we leave behind in our family. We might look to the things that we've accomplished in our work and our celebrations. We may even try to find, some people are really into nature. How are we connected to the cosmos and the nature, and what part of us live on, become a part of the earth. And of course, there are plenty who look to understand death, our life after death, recognizing that there's a part of us that will not die, that our soul goes on to be with God, and we are released from the troubles of this world. But much of these common responses that we encounter actually come from a misplaced faith. A misplaced faith. You see, good grief embraces our loss. Good grief embraces our loss and instead turns our hearts to God. This past week, we were on our way to baseball practice, and as I've got a job to do and I get busy and distracted, I'm unloading the vehicle, I hear Tirsa say, "Dad, look, ants!" And it's like, okay, who really stops to look at the ants in a park or in a parking lot, right? But Tirsa does, even on this morning as we're unloading the trailer. Ants! I don't know what it is about ants, but she notices the little details. And I think I initially gave her one of those, like, the response you give as a parent when you're not really paying attention to your kids. Like, "Oh, that's nice, dear," right? We've all done that. And then Benjamin goes, "Whoa!" And I'm like, okay, now I gotta see what's going on. Benjamin's super excited. And I look, and I kid you not, like, there's an 8-foot long curb completely covered in this frenzy of ants. And I thought, how many times did we just walk by ants and never even notice them? Here was something kind of amazing and kind of cool, and I don't know if it's because like the storm was coming, and somebody that knows nature can explain to me what was going on there later, but like there were all these ants, and I wondered how many times do I miss stuff simply because I walked past and I never pay attention to what's there, what's down below. And I realize we do the same thing with our grief, don't we? And we kind of skip past it. We don't even recognize what's going on. You see, God knows the condition of our heart. The question is, do we know the condition of our own hearts? The path of good grief begins when we recognize where we are. We call it being mindful, right? Being mindful of what we are feeling, being mindful of what we are thinking, understanding what it is that we are going through. You see, grief comes in waves, and we pay attention to those waves, and sometimes it feels like the waves of an ocean crashing on the shore, and we are being overwhelmed, and we feel like we are being pounded. The next moment, it might feel like a calm sea where we feel a sense of peace. And it kind of comes and it goes, and the interesting thing about grief, when people talk about stages of grief, it's not always a linear process, right? You don't go through, okay, now I'm going through stage 1, now I'm going through stage 2. Sometimes you go all over the place. And sometimes multiple stages hit you all at once, and it's just this confusing chaos that we are in. But it helps to know where we are, to recognize what that moment is that we are in. Often the first stage of grief that we talk about is the stage of shock or denial, right? Reality hasn't set in. We just received the phone call. We just received the news, and we can't believe it. It's hard to accept emotionally. Then there might come this moment where we begin to express our emotions. Sometimes this comes like after the funeral service, after we've gotten our job done, and suddenly it begins to hit us, and we might feel overwhelmed with an emotional release, maybe feeling sad, grieving the loss of that person. Where we become aware of, and we might even talk about what it is we are feeling, our emotions. Then comes maybe a stage of loneliness or depression. You lose someone who's extremely close, there's a part of you that just longs, and you feel like there's no one else who quite will understand me. You leave a work situation, you're like, man, I've lost all my friends. All the people I've spent the last 10 years working with and building relationships are suddenly gone from my life. Something changes, a relationship changes, and suddenly we're overwhelmed with feelings of loneliness. And it might even cause us to wonder, like, God, do you even care what I'm going through? We might even begin to experience some doubts of our own. God, are you there? And it's important that when people are in this area, if you are around them, to let them share their concerns, to let them share their doubts, but to do so with empathy. To do so with genuine concern, and to be that friend who reminds them that they are not alone. That you are with them, and that you can get through this together. Sometimes we experience physical symptoms of distress, right? Bodies might be. Maybe we're not hungry for a while. Maybe we're really hungry, and that extra bowl of ice cream and banana and peanut butter that I love sounds really good because it needs some sort of comfort food. Sometimes we experience anxiety, right? We have difficulty concentrating. It just feels like everything's wired and it's hard to focus or concentrate. Maybe we're thinking about our fears, like, what will I do now that they are gone? How will I provide for my family if I've lost my job? Who will take care of the kids when I'm gone? Sometimes we struggle with guilt. If you've ever lost a close loved one to suicide, we sometimes call it that survivor's guilt, where we spend our time thinking, man, if I only would have known, if only they would have called me, maybe if I would have done this, then that wouldn't have happened. And sometimes we wrestle with that feeling of guilt, maybe not even in that situation, but other situations. Maybe we regret things that we did or didn't do, things we said or didn't say. We feel guilty for not cherishing that moment that we had. Sometimes comes that moment of anger or resentment. We might be mad at them for leaving us. We might be mad at God, thinking, God, why did you take this person from me? Become irritable or critical over little things that maybe wouldn't have bothered us otherwise. You ever meet someone who it seems like they're stuck in their grief? Or it seems like they just refuse to move on? Sometimes we can be resistant. Because we think someone's got to remember this person. Someone's got to keep that memory alive. Someone's got to grieve for that person. Or maybe, you know what? We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it. It's like it didn't happen. Don't come to me. Don't remind me. But there are also some stages that are a little bit more positive. Like when hope begins to grow. When that little seed of hope is planted. We don't always know how long we'll be in that grieving process. In ways, we will grieve the loss of someone who was dear to us our entire lives, right? We won't forget that. But we also begin to feel this hope building up. This hope that they are with God. That they have found their place with Jesus, and that one day we too can see them again. We find hope in one another, don't we? How many times has someone been there for you in that difficult moment? How many times has someone encouraged you or sat and listened or prayed with you? There comes that stage where it seems like we can finally, I don't really like the word acceptance, because sometimes it's hard and we don't want to accept it, but we can at least affirm our present circumstances and affirm reality for what it is. Doesn't mean we go back to the way things were, because we've changed, haven't we? You go through that hard time. Justin, you're a different person after going through cancer, right? You have a different perspective on life, and it's not like we go back to the way things were before, but something of us has changed. And maybe we turn that grief into action to share our story and encourage others and recognize that we are not alone. The psalmist gives voice to that moment of in-between, don't they? In fact, over a third of the book of Psalms contains laments. And we can see, I think one of the things that I would conclude from this is that our grief is actually part of our worship, isn't it? If there are 38% of the book of Psalms, I forget the number, was it 57? Somebody can do the math for me. Psalms that contain lament, it helps me realize that grief is actually a part of our worship. It could be a form of our worship. And we realize that if that's the case, then it is okay for us to let our hearts cry out to God. In those moments of brokenness, in those moments of anger, in those moments of pain, God can take it. God is listening. God understands our pain. God is with us even in those valleys. You see, good grief is a part of our worship. And it's worship that helps turn our hearts to God. Now, as I mentioned, there are two basic parts to the lament. And if you have your Bibles and you want to follow along, I'm going to select Psalm chapter 6. It's a psalm of lament. And the first part of the psalm is that plea section, and the latter half is that praise. And so beginning Psalm chapter 6, kind of in the middle of your Bible there, beginning verse 1, it says this: O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. My soul also is struck with terror. While you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, and save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with weeping. My eyes waste away because of my grief. They grow weak because of all of my foes. Here the psalmist makes their heart known, right? God, do not rebuke me in your anger. God, how long must I go through this? God, how long must we suffer? Heal me, save me, deliver me for the sake of your love. You see, our plea gives voice to our hearts. It helps us become mindful of our circumstances, and it helps turn our hearts to God, the object and the source of our hope. The psalmist goes on to say, the section of praise begins verse 8. It says, Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and struck with terror. They shall turn back in a moment and be put to shame. Now what happened? Anything changed there? He's anticipating the praise, isn't he? We live in that moment between the plea and the praise, and here the psalmist offers words of praise based on what they believe God will do. You see, sometimes we can offer praise for things that we hope for, something we believe that God will do. We give thanks. We give God our thanks and our praise, acknowledging what he can do on our behalf. Sometimes we praise God based on the past, what has already happened, the promises that we received from God. Ann Voskamp, in her book, 1,000 Gifts, A Dare to Live Fully Right Where You Are, speaks about the role of thanksgiving in Jesus' miracles. The Greek word is eucharisteo. And she points out how eucharisteo often precedes the miracle. That Jesus gives thanks first. God, I thank you that you hear me. God, I thank you that you are a God who can heal. And then comes the healing, directing our attention to God. Eucharisteo, she says, always precedes the miracle. And who doesn't need a miracle like that every day? You see, I think it points out that our praise makes room for the miracle to grow in our life, doesn't it? It turns our attention to the object and the source of our hope. It invites God to work in our lives, to work in this moment, even in our hardest and most painful moments. You see, we often find ourselves in the middle of the lament between the plea and the praise. And as we let our hearts speak, it helps us realize that, you know what? God is listening. God is with us. God is working, even in this moment. But maybe you're thinking, like, how can I possibly let God know what I'm thinking or what I'm going through, right? I can't yell or scream or cry out against God. Like, what would God really think of me? Can I let you in on a little secret? God already knows. Right? God already knows what we're thinking. God already knows what we're struggling with. God knows when we're angry. I mean, you ever try to hide your anger from your spouse before? They know, don't they? Right? God knows the condition of our hearts. But at least by crying out to God, I think it would be better to say, God, I'm really ticked off at you right now. God, I'm not supposed to lose a high school youth. Right? They're supposed to graduate. They're supposed to finish college. They're supposed to get married and have kids and have this happily ever after. God, how could you let this happen? But at least when I cry out to God, it turns my attention back to God. And I realize that God has heard that prayer. I realize that God knows what I'm going through. And God can help me through that moment of grief. That God will not forsake us. You see, letting our hearts speak turns them back to God. Letting our hearts speak turns us back to God. Our laments, our prayers, our worship turns our hearts to God, even when we wonder, God, are you still there? God, do you care? Help me in this moment. And it helps us discover the God who hears us, the God who is with us, the God who loves us. Psalm 116 contains one of those moments. In my Bible, the heading says, Thanksgiving for Recovery from Illness, where the psalmist comes back and says, Gracious is the Lord and righteous is our God. Our God is merciful. The Lord protects the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to rest. Kind of like asking, God, give me peace again. For the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. And I love this line. I walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I kept my faith even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. You see, experiencing heartache isn't a sign of weakness. Telling God how much you are angry or how much you are hurting at him isn't a sign of doubt or lack of faith. But it's about recognizing that moment we are in, experiencing the loss, letting our hearts speak, realizing that God is listening. The Apostle Paul knew this really well, didn't he? He knew a thing or two about suffering, and yet his faith was always anchored in something beyond hardships and heartaches that he faced. In Romans chapter 8, maybe you have some of these verses memorized for yourself. Paul talks about some of this hardship and the hope that he has, the future glory in Christ. He says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. No matter what we go through in this life, no matter how bad it is, it can't even fathom how great it will be when we are united with God. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom and the glory of the children of God. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And now we know this. We know that in all things work together for the good, for those who love God, and who are called according to his purpose. Or as my Greek professor pointed out, in regard to all things, God works for the good of those who are in Christ Jesus. It doesn't mean that God will spare us the heartache or the pain, but we realize that God can redeem those moments in our life. God can redeem our losses. God is with us no matter the struggles we face. For as Paul closes the chapter, he says, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Nothing. Our place with God is secure. So let your heart speak. God is listening. Good grief experiences the loss and turns our hearts back to God. Let us pray. God, we recognize that our understanding is so limited. We don't always understand what's going on in the world. We see images on the news. We hear losses of friends, and we can't even fathom how much pain, how much suffering is going on right now. God, sometimes we're not even aware of what it is that we are going through, how much we are hurting, and yet there's a part of our soul that just cries out. God, we don't even have the words at times to fully express what it is that we need, and yet you are a God who listens. You are a God who knows us, and so help us to trust in you. Help us to have that faith to know that you are with us, even in those hard times, even in those valleys, that we are not alone. And God, as you lift up our spirits, as you help us through our own moments of loss, our own moments of heartache, our own moments of grief, may you uplift us that we may be a light, an encouragement, and a hope to those around us as well. God, redeem our stories with your love. Continue to strengthen our faith in this journey that we find ourselves on. Pray for all this, Lord. In Christ's name. I'm going to invite our worship team to come up and share with us another song or two. And as we take a moment here, this first song we are doing is God Turn It Around. And as we think about those heartaches or those losses we've encountered, maybe you know somebody going through a hard time, may we use this time as a time of reflection, prayer, and worship. Recognizing the God who can redeem our lives, who can redeem our stories, and turn anything around.
Rain God come, Turn this thing around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. Calling on the name changes everything. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. All of my hope is in the name of Jesus. Breakthrough will come in the name of Jesus. God, turn it around. 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 I invite you to stand up and join. Rain God, come and turn this thing around. Sing it to me. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. Calling on the name that changes everything. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. All of my hope is in the name of Jesus. The breakthrough will come in the name of Jesus. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. Right now. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. God, turn it around. He is up to something. He is up to something. God is doing something. Right now, He is up to something. He is up to something. God is doing something. Right now, He is healing someone. He is saving someone. God is doing something. Right now, He is healing someone. He is saving someone. God is doing something. Right now, He is moving mountains, making a way for someone. God is doing something. Right now, He is moving mountains, making a way for someone. God is doing something. Right now, all of my hope is in the name of Jesus. Breakthrough will come in the name of Jesus. God, turn it around. 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 God, turn it around.
As you go forth from this place, may the God of hope fill you with all kinds of hope and encouragement, that you may be that light shining for others as we walk this journey together. Go with God's peace.
I raise a hallelujah in the presence of In the middle